Welcome to Behavioral Grooves. My name is Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. Behavioral Grooves is the podcast where we typically have interesting long-form discussions with a researcher or a practitioner of behavioral science to explore why we do what we do.
And in this episode, we do that, but we amped it up. In this episode, we spoke with not one, but two guests.
Yeah.
Joe Marks and Steve Martin.
Steve Martin? The Steve Martin? Like the wild and crazy guy, Steve Martin?
Okay, so he is a Steve Martin, but he is not the world-famous comedian, actor, and banjo player. Although he might play banjo. Yeah. I don't know. We didn't ask him that. So, it was,
He could be a banjo player.
Could be a banjo player, yeah. So this Steve Martin, however, is much more important for our purposes because he's a professor at Columbia Graduate School of Business and a researcher who's worked with Robert Cialdini on several papers and the book, Yes, 50 Scientifically Proven Ways to Be Persuasive, which, by the way, is a great read.
Yeah, totally. Okay, so this Steve Martin has lots of great research to share, and we're glad that he could join us. But what about Joe Marks? Is it possible that he's related to Groucho, Chico, Harpo, and Zeppo?
Tim, really? Are you going? You're going to 2 strikes, man. Oh, 2 strikes. Come on. His name is spelled different. And second, he holds a teaching and research position at the University College and MIT. And third, this Joe Marks is the grandson of the 20th century British physician who helped reform the National Health Service in England.
Man, these guys are really impressive.
Okay, so you got that one right. Okay. All right. You're doing okay there. All right.
Okay, the listeners should know that the reason that we recorded both of them for this episode is that they recently co-authored a terrific book called Messengers: Who We Listen To, Who We Don't, and Why. Anyone who needs to communicate, whether you're in marketing, sales, human resources, politics, customer service, customer experience, should pick up this book and read it cover to cover. It's really well written with lots of great research and lots of practical applications.
I couldn't agree more. It's a great read, and these two guys were great to talk with. It will definitely make our 2020 Behavioral Grooves top 10 book list.
Definitely.
Pretty sure, right?
Yeah.
But before we get to our discussion with Steve and Joe, we've had a bunch of really nice reviews recently, and we want to take a couple minutes to just share some of the comments that these listeners have about Behavioral Grooves.
Yeah, that's a good idea, Kurt. So we got a 5-star rating and some very kind words from Clyde Fess, who lives in the United States. And Clyde Fess said, Tim and Kurt explore a variety of different topics, all related to how we behave and how we make decisions. Spoiler alert, we are not logical as humans. They host researchers and behavioral economists to discuss subjects like bias, incentives, recognition, and motivation. This is one of my top 5 podcasts I listen to on a weekly basis. Subscribe today. Wow. Thank you, Clyde Fess.
Thank you. No kidding. That was nice. Oh, I wonder if he's the only one who thinks that. No. Oh, wait. No, we have another one. There's one more that we want to hear from today, and we want to put it on air today because we want to make sure that it doesn't get too far away from the episode that it's referencing. So this comment and 5-star rating comes from Dima in Germany. Dima had some nice things to say about our Behavioral Grooves episode 107 with Rory Sutherland. Dima said, I really enjoyed the episode with Rory. You can never get enough of him. I like that you sum up the talk at the end and even twice. It's a joy listening to you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dima.
Yeah, no kidding. Thank you so much, Dima. And thanks to Clyde Fess as well. And we promise to read other reviews in future episodes because they're all so fun.
Yeah.
And I'd like to point out the idea of the recap at the end of the episode. We call it the bonus track. And that was an idea from a listener as well.
Yeah, it was from listener Fred Bomber, who sent us a message encouraging us to add a summary of the points that we've discussed during the episode. He said that he listened to the podcast while doing chores around the house, specifically mowing the lawn in the summer. Yeah. And he said he didn't always have something to write down the key takeaways and that he would really like a summary to be able to do that. And so that sparked the idea that became the foundation for our bonus track. We added on to that with our groove idea for the week, and we hope that you're enjoying both of those.
Okay, so is it time to get to our discussion with Steve and Joe?
one more thing.
Oh.
If you'd like to have your review read during the introduction of the podcast, just jump down to the bottom of the Behavior Grooves section on your app and the pod chaser that you're using and write down what you think of behavioral grooves.
Yeah, that sounds pretty easy.
I think it is.
I'd also like to hear how long it takes listeners to actually write a review.
Okay.
I'm just curious about this. I would be willing to bet. I'd be willing to bet that someone can write a review in less than 49 seconds.
Okay. So you're betting me? You want to bet me?
I'll bet you lunch. If listeners come back and say I can write a review in less than 49 seconds, then I'll buy
lunch. Lunch with a beer. And you're on.
Okay. All right.
All right.
I'll
Lunch with a beer and you're on. And so, listeners, if you write a review and you do it in less than 49 seconds, I will buy Tim lunch with a beer.
Yeah.
And if you write a review, but it takes you longer than 49 seconds, Tim will buy me lunch with a beer. So if you like me, just do a nicely well-thought review and take your time. And if you like Tim, just do a crappy half-ass job and just get it done. There you go.
This is going to become like this is a prom thing, This is a prom king deal. Oh, man.
All right. So the bet is on. So listeners, let us know how long it takes you to write the review, and we will have some fun with that in a future episode.
Yes, we will. Okay, with that, it is time to sit back with your favorite messenger beverage and enjoy our conversation with Steve Martin and Joe Marks. Steve Martin and Joe Marks, welcome to the Behavioral Grooves podcast.
Hey, Kurt. Hey, Tim. Brilliant to be here.
Thank you very much for having us.
Oh, yeah, we are excited.
We are excited. We should actually just introduce voices. So, Steve, hello to Steve.
Hello there. I am Steve.
And Joe. Joe, give us a hello.
Hi, Kurt and Tim. I'm Joe.
Yeah, great.
Right.
Okay, good
there
deal.
We go.
So let's start with a speed round.
All right. So I'm going to, first one's going to you, Steve. So bicycle or unicycle?
Bicycle.
Bicycle. All right.
Joe, coffee or tea?
Or tea.
Of course.
Okay, of course. There we go.
Yeah.
All right. Going back to you, Steve. A year without a mobile phone or a year without a laptop? You had to have one. Mobile phone. All right.
You would choose the mobile phone or get rid of the mobile phone?
No. Get rid of the mobile phone, but I'd keep the laptop, please.
Wow.
Okay.
That's pretty terrific. Okay, here's a toss-up, maybe for both of you. Which is more valuable, trustworthiness or truthfulness?
Oh. We're going to have a conversation about that, I think, today.
That sounds good. Let's have a conversation about that. That's a good way to get started. Joe, you look like you're kind of on the verge of jumping in on that. Why don't
I think it really depends on your perspective and what your goals are and what you're trying to achieve, because we can see quite clearly that truthfulness and trustworthiness are not always the same thing, where people may be clearly lying, they're getting fact-checked in court lying, and yet specifically supporters of theirs seem to still regard them in kind of high regard and trust them. So what's going on there? And it's one of these questions that seems to be puzzling society at the moment. Academics and political commentators are baffled and trying to put together some explanation. And the truth of it is that trustworthiness is really a prediction of somebody's future good faith. It's not this kind of complex weighting of evidence that we use to assess truthfulness. We're not kind of going to the bottom line of everyone's detailed sentences and trying to work out, well, does the evidence suggest that this is likely to be 40% false or 30% true? What is that computation? They're not doing that. We're relying on much more simple heuristics when assessing trustworthiness, because it's this kind of intuitive, vague, abstract judgment that people are very good at making and have to make on very limited information very quickly.
Well, wouldn't truthfulness though be a factor in that prediction of future trustworthy? I mean, if I'm looking at somebody and I'm going, all right, even if I'm a believer in them or a supporter of them, And I go, well, that's not true, but I'll withhold that judgment and look forward to the future. Doesn't that start weighing down after a while? And yet somehow it doesn't seem like that's happening.
Yeah. No, that is true. I mean, we rely on people's past behavior to predict future behavior.
Yeah.
But I think there's a few key kind of caveats to that. One is, a lie about something seemingly kind of doesn't direct towards your core principles and values and judgments and the things that people hold you to. Whereas, if for example, Boris Johnson was to turn around tomorrow and say, actually, we're not doing Brexit, or Trump was, to go completely against his core values and principles, then those people who were regarding him as trustworthy would not anymore. But they excuse the lies that seem sort of sort of around the fact that are kind of seen as a means to an end to get to a place that actually they want to be going, that they want to see society going in. They excuse a little lie if they think that the underlying core position is one that they like.
Well,
Right.
actually, I think it's the case that sometimes they'll excuse not just a little lie, but a big lie. There's no doubt, the Supreme Court here in the United Kingdom, decreed that Johnson lied when he prorogued our Parliament back in October of last year. In fact, Joe and I ran a little study, a survey of sorts, with Leave and Remain voters. And all of them, the vast majority, over 75% of them, when asked, do you think that Boris Johnson lied to the Queen, to pro-government, they said yes, he absolutely did. And then when we asked, so how does that affect your trustworthiness of Boris Johnson? It had no effect for those people that had voted to leave the European Union. So it wasn't just a little lie. This is a big whopper.
Yeah.
And despite the fact that the overwhelming majority of people, regardless of their political allegiance, reckon that he lied, and clearly he did. The relative trustworthiness of Johnson wasn't tainted at all with his supporters, because fundamentally his lies served an underlying goal that they had all signed up to. So sometimes we are willing for people to lie to us, provided it's the kind of lie that goes in the direction that we ideally want to end up in.
Right.
Exactly.
Which is kind of a form of confirmation bias in some ways, isn't it? That we're so attached to finding something that supports and confirms what we already believe or want to believe, that we're willing to forego things like the truth.
Yeah, I guess what's the amplification here, though, Kurt and Tim, is the fact that confirmation bias often is done in private, often, isn't it? It's just like the person that we only really need to admit confirmation bias to is ourselves. We don't have to do it publicly. But in this instance, we're actually asking people, they're being quite clear. Yes, he lied. I recognize he lies, but I still think this. That's a pretty extreme version of confirmation bias when people are willing to publicly state that.
Yeah. Well, and this is one of the tenets that you guys talk about in your book, right? So Messenger is the new book that you guys have just come out with. It is by fantastic. We have it.
We loved it.
It was top pick of ours.
Made our top 10.
Made our top 10 for 2019. So congrats on that. Not that that means anything except for maybe to the 10 listeners that we have. But no. So tell us a little bit about how did Messengers come about? What was the impetus for it? How did you guys get that kernel of an idea?
Well, perhaps I'll start, and then Joe, you should come in. So, Kurt, Tim, you know about me, and you know about my my long-term allegiance with Bob Cialdini. So I've been an influence and persuasion researcher for quite a few years now, working under the stewardship of Bob Cialdini. And one of the things that we've increasingly noticed these last few years is Bob did just an incredibly brilliant job of disseminating what are the factors that go into a message that increase the likelihood that someone will say yes to it. But Joe and I would recognize, we've got an office here in London. We, a team of behavioral scientists, we'd often have lunch together, and we come up with these examples often of where people would say something that really made little sense, yet people were still being engaged with it. And so we wonder, well, it's kind of interesting here is it's not just what you put into a message. There's something here about who delivers the message that seems to be having a significant, in fact, we'd go so far as to say an increasingly significant influence over whether it gains traction. And all of us have experienced this in our everyday lives. We've all had a situation where, we've had an idea, we go to the office, we tell a colleague about this idea or mention it to, someone, and they look at us in that strange way. They think, that's really not a good idea at all. And yet a couple of days later, someone else comes along, says the exact same thing. And I can see you laughing here because you know where this is going. Yeah.
All too familiar.
All too familiar. Someone says the exact same thing, and all of a sudden, the same audience that rejected roundly your suggestion 2 days ago are enthusiastically embracing the exact same idea when it came from someone else. So it can't be the message that is carrying sway here. There must be something about the quality of the messenger or the trait or feature of the messenger that's allowing people to say, well, to hell with the content. That probably matters less now. If this person is saying it, then I'll follow it. And what we found...
Was there an experience? It almost sounds like certainly your observation and your ability to kind of look at the human condition and see this incongruity is a catalyst, right? But I'm wondering, Steve, was there a specific experience that just really grabbed you and said, "Oh man, we've really got to tell this story"?
Well, it seems that every single day in the newspapers, there seems to be some sort of headline that says, X said Y, believe Z, and you think, well, actually, really, is that true? I mean, personally, there's been at least hundreds of dozens of times, I'm sure, where I've presented an idea or come up with some concept over the years, and people have looked and went, I don't think about it. And then suddenly, a couple of weeks later, you go, actually, I'm sure I said something about that. And so,
well, that's all the time. I say something, and then it gets just poo-pooed, and then Tim says it, and then everybody loves it.
yeah, exactly. But there was something scientifically intriguing about this as well, because one of the things that Joe and I did early on when we were having this discussion was to say, well, there must be tons of research out there looking at this. And actually there is. There's 6-7 decades of, largely social psychological research, but in other fields of behavioral science as well. But what was really interesting to us is that no one had really synthesized that information, in a way that Bob Cialdini did with the social influence theory. It was actually back to the early 1980s when a couple of researchers came up with their 5 characteristic model of what makes a good messenger. And of course, that 40 odd years that's actually passed since then, extraordinary amounts of new research has been conducted, not just standard social psychological research, but behavioral economic research, neurological information, and neuroscientific research as well. So that was kind of like the platform for us to say, well, there's an opportunity here to kind of really delve into this and see what comes out. And what we think we've done is, or like to think we've done, is come up with perhaps a more contemporary, updated version of who a society listens to or is more likely to listen to, who they're likely to reject, and the reasoning why. And at no point throughout the book do Joe and I ever really consider the merits of what's being said, the content of the message. We're just interested in why can this messenger deliver this message in a way that it gains traction, and someone else comes along and says the exact same thing, and the same audience will reject it. That sounds crazy, but
yeah, it was so great. One of my favorite aspects of the book is this beautiful confluence that you've always got going of anecdotes and tremendous amounts of research. I mean, and so much, as you mentioned, is contemporary. You're not relying on the studies from 1983. Of course, if they were groundbreaking and they still hold up, then absolutely you reference them. But the references are just terrific with the magnitude and the variety that you go to, as you said. And I think that's one of the things that really makes this book different from a lot of other stuff on the market today. So when it comes to our listeners, I just want them to think about, wow, you're drawing from a wide variety of different fields and really building a case in a cogent and sophisticated way, and it's entirely readable. It was just really fun to read too. So we had a lot of fun. Okay, but I want to get back to the Marshall McLuhan comment. This whole idea of the messenger. I mean, in the 1960s, Canadian Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message, and you guys are kind of claiming that sort of is dead. That the new model is the messenger is the message. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, I don't think I'd go so far as to say the old model's dead, replace it with our new, better model, and scrap that. I think certainly medium matters, and there's great evidence showing that face-to-face communication, for example, can be up to 3 times more persuasive than an email, because there's kind of the directness of it. You're speaking to somebody, you see their humanity, you have this social obligation not to say no in a face-to-face interaction. It's much easier to ghost somebody on a text or email. I think there's a lot going on. And similarly, we're in this world now where there's all kinds of mediums, like on Twitter and in the news, you have kind of information being presented rapidly in very short amounts of characters. And
podcasts,
exactly, which is a nice, lengthier, more detailed chat and a version I prefer, I think. But I think that still matters. But I think in conjunction with that is the kind of neglected side of the messenger, and specifically the kind of traits that make an effective messenger.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for a minute. Yeah.
So this is the kind of second part of where Steve was leading into. So I guess we were thinking about this phenomenon that happens where, I see it all the time hanging around with Steve. People will take on board exactly what he says. If I say it, then they don't. But
sorry, Joe, were you saying something?
Yeah. And you do feel like a Cassandra in that case. And the question is, well, what makes somebody a good, effective messenger or a Cassandra? And that knowledge is perhaps relevant to improve one's own kind of communication and persuasion skills, but also, helpful in helping us to spot where we might be listening to somebody not based on the content of their message or the kind of wisdom of it, but in fact just because of who they are. So the book is really dedicated to examining the factors that make us receptive to a messenger, and we divide it into 2 parts. So we have status traits and connectedness traits. So status is essentially earned. We describe through one of 4 routes, and essentially gives people some kind of value that means that they're worthy of being listened to. Some way they've got themselves ahead of us, and so are useful. They can make for kind of powerful allies or fierce foes. And connectedness, on the other hand, they're not really trying to get ahead. In fact, the opposite. They're trying to kind of get along with us. We see them as a friend, somebody to cooperate with. They show us kind of benevolent intent. And so, we kind of look at these 2 broad categories of messenger and dive deep into, well, how do you earn yourself status? How do you earn yourself connectedness? And that really is the kind of layout and structure of the book.
One of the interesting studies that you brought up that I find that was just fascinating for me, because I would not have anticipated, I guess I might have anticipated it, but it was the jaywalking study that you mentioned, that, the people who were better dressed, more people would follow them and jaywalk than people wearing denim, various different pieces of it. And so status from that perspective takes on a whole lot of other roles as opposed to just a positional status, right? There are other markers that kind of identify that. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And what that's actually doing, that in that case, that uniform or that business suit, for want of a better word, is it's sending a signal about someone's status within a society. And often, we're in this situation, particularly these days, where it's becoming increasingly hard difficult to kind of navigate our way through all the information that's presented to us, all the data off of it, often very conflicting data. And so, we'll often replace that question, what is the right thing to do here, with the question of, well, who looks like they're doing what the right thing to do is here, and I'll just follow them. And that idea that, 3 times as many people, and by the way, this was a study that goes back to the mid-60s, 3 times as many people were willing to follow someone wearing a suit into traffic, against the red light, against the law, than the same person dressed in a denim jacket. And we find that it's not just, so the message here isn't just don't put a business suit on rather than a denim jacket. It's what those cues are. We find similar with cars. That wonderful study that Anthony Doob ran in San Francisco all those years ago, where he wanted to understand how quickly someone would hoot their horn if a car in front had actually kind of broken down at a crossroads. And he found that the status of the car mattered. Even though people were much more inclined to think that they'd hoot quicker at a high status car, they hooted much, much quicker at a low status car. So these, I guess, features of status, in this instance, it could be a status that communicates our competence, or in the case of the car, communicates perhaps our socio-economic position. They're important. We use these pieces of information to determine whether or not, if someone then says something or makes a recommendation or acts in a certain way, whether they're worth following. It's one of the reasons why, when you meet someone for the very first time, one of the first questions you can ask is, well, what do you do? Essentially, what you're actually saying is, where are you on the socioeconomic hierarchical status compared to me? That's what's really going on there. So these are important, and we'll use them for proxies to determine whether or not someone is worth listening to or not.
I grew up in St. Louis, and in St. Louis with the Arch, yes. And the people from St. Louis don't ask, "What do you do?" The first question they ask is, "Where did you go to high school?" And that is the socioeconomic peg that drives all the further discussions, because it identifies whether you went to a public school or a private school, and what part of town you grew up in, and if it was a all single gender, or there's all kinds of boxing and segmenting that happens with the answer to that question.
Yeah,
I think it's fascinating,
and it allows us to quickly answer that question: do you have status over me, or am I connected with you? Which, are those two, what we call hard and soft traits that Joe was talking about a few moments ago.
Well, let's talk a little bit. We talked a little bit about status, and I know there's a bunch more there, but connectedness. So what is it about connectedness, and what did you find out about how that influences how people perceive the message that people are sending?
Yeah, I guess the equivalent question would be when you meet somebody for the first time, oh, who do you know? I also know them. And you realize that you have these mutual connections. Another one that's very common and kind of natural to us. And really, it's serving to find that connectedness between the two and find where we have similarities, people we share in common who we perhaps hopefully like. If we decide somebody maybe is connected to people we dislike, maybe we're going to associate them negatively. But essentially, it's trying to, form that cooperative allegiance with somebody else. And, we're humans. We form bonds very quickly and easily. It's kind of a fundamental desire of humankind to do that because we work better together. And can achieve goals that we just couldn't alone. So we look for certain signals of benevolence, such as warmth and trustworthiness, that are incredibly important to then decide who we're likely to listen to and not. And so, for an example of warmth, then we can see it in all manners of areas. It seems to be those who are able to show a kind of kind positivity and rapport with other people. They show that they care about the other. They express concern for their welfare. These people are doing much better in various areas in terms of the labor market, where they often kind of will work better together, more productively with others. They'll kind of be rewarded favors more often and even get hired more often. one of the number one tips for a job interview is to kind of make eye contact, smile, be polite and courteous. And these are kind of trivial factors in a way when you think about the experience, skills that we really look for when we're thinking about hiring somebody, but they matter a great deal.
Yeah, and I wonder how much, what part of these, both sets of traits, both the status and the connectedness, are anthropological. How deeply are they ingrained in our DNA, do you think?
Well, I think they are linked to some of these evolutionary factors. But perhaps before we talk about that, it might be a good idea just to set out what those 4 traits within the hard messenger domains and the 4 traits within the softer messenger domain is. So, as Joe suggested earlier, so hard messengers are these messengers that seek to essentially establish some sort of status over their audience before they deliver a message, and they do this in one of 4 ways. They do it through their socio-economic position, so essentially how rich and famous they are. We follow the lead of those that we see perhaps as rich and famous sometimes as a good signal of whether or not we should listen to someone. Competence or perceived competence, the extent to which someone sounds like an expert, looks like an expert, is an expert, can influence our reaction to their message. Dominance is the third one. Dominance is an interesting one because very much, I think, a personality trait, a dispositional characteristic. These are the kind of messengers that just, they have that attitude that they need to win at all costs. Everything is a competition. And I'm not interested in collaborating with you. I'm interested in being dominant over you, of, almost kind of like coercing you into some sort of receptivity to my message. And we all know characters like that. And 1 or 2 names come to mind immediately for all of us.
Yes.
And the 4th hard trait is attractiveness. Sometimes there are people that have been blessed genetically, and because of their good looks, their symmetry, their youthfulness, and interestingly, their averageness as well is one of the characteristics of attractiveness. We may be more predisposed to listen to them. And so if you think about attractiveness, you think about perhaps dominance from a certain perspective, those are arguably kind of more ingrained evolutionary in their nature, whereas anyone, I guess, could, through their hard work, become an expert or become rich or famous. So those perhaps are more societally endorsed or gained. And then by contrast, the connected effects are warmth, as Joe's already spoken about, those that seek to signal their benevolence rather than their status over others. Vulnerability is a second one. One way that we can sometimes arrange for people to listen to us is to express some sort of vulnerability or weakness that we actually have, or disadvantage that can often engage and connect people to us. Trustworthiness is the third one, kind of where we started out. And then finally, charisma. Charisma is a really interesting one, that ability to, essentially connect with an audience in such a way that, there's almost like a unifying goal that you engender people towards. And what's really interesting about charisma from a scientific perspective is it was only a short while ago, 2016, I think it was, when the social scientific community actually agreed upon a consensus for an agenda of what charisma actually is. So those are the 4 hard, 4 soft effects, and we consider them not I am one or I am the other, but more as kind of dials that, depending if they're signaled in the right way and at the right time and in the right context, can significantly increase the likelihood that a message will be listened to and accepted, regardless of its merits or truthfulness. That's the really interesting thing.
Well, and it was interesting too, because you talked about in the book, you talked about sometimes that some of those things, given the context, backfired, right? And so that there were examples of this where I can't remember I think it was Safeway, the grocery stores, or if that was the one. I'm not sure, where they train their people to be smile and be forthcoming and all this kind of thing. And yet there was some backfire in how people interpreted that and various different things. So context matters in this matter, doesn't it?
Yeah, and in that particular example, it was particularly female attractive servers who started to then get harassed because the male customers just took it as a come on. They thought this lovely lady is being very flirty with me. She obviously is into me. I'm going to give her my number. It's that overconfident male stereotype.
Where our minds go, right? There we go. That's bad.
And little did they realize that actually she was being forced to make eye contact and smile, and if she didn't, would suffer some sanctions. So there's an example of where, a certain kind of very rough and rigid way of trying to implement these messenger effects can indeed backfire and result in lawsuits in the extreme case. Mm-hmm. But, in each chapter, I think we try and kind of put forward the costs and benefits, and they're, from an evolutionary perspective, it's likely to happen that otherwise we would have all evolved to be the same way. There's going to be some benefit to certain traits and some cost to other traits at times. Specifically with regard to kind of dominance and warmth or vulnerability, these kind of trade off a lot of the time, where you can kind of take a harder versus a softer approach. And actually, some of the very interesting recent research coming out of Denmark has been showing that this context really affects when we listen to dominant types. So particularly in times of kind of social conflict, competition, and anxiety, we see people are much more likely to want to elect a dominant type of leader who can kind of be combative and lead their group in a fight. Whereas in kind of calmer, surer times, then we prefer a soft messenger who's able to, cooperate with others, make alliances, get people to collaborate, it's very intriguing as to those kind of contextual factors as well, when these traits might be useful and when less so.
I guess it's probably not going to be lost. Yeah, I think so. I don't think it'll be lost on a number of your listeners, probably a large number of them, that these dominant characters, how they essentially provoke a context and an environment of uncertainty and anxiety and unrest, knowing that doing so allows their predisposed dominant character to almost kind of step up and be the hero to solve the very conflict that they actually created in the first place. So and we've seen.
You look at both of our countries. You look at both of our countries in the past elections that have happened, and you can you can go to that. You can go that a lot of the anxiety that has been developed out, particularly in the U.S., in the whole immigration component, which, for many years, immigrants were viewed as a very positive impact on our country, and the message that got shifted there. And then, as you said, Donald Trump, well, you didn't say that, but Donald Trump.
I think you just said it, but we should get it out on the table. Yeah.
Took that anxiety around that and kind of built on that. And he has I would say a very domineering persona. So
what's really interesting is the UK and the US are probably the obvious examples, highly individualistic countries generally. But you see it happen in collective cultures as well. So I'm thinking here about Brazil, I'm thinking about China. Equally, they have similar situations where they've got, very dominant characters as leaders that will often point to, unrest, conflict, challenge, to essentially legitimize their personality. And the want and need for it. So, it's not a Northern Hemisphere thing, or in this instance, it's very much, I think, in this instance, a human characteristic to want to kind of seek out those, dominant, assured messengers when we feel, anxious or afraid.
Yeah.
So I want to keep going on this political stuff. You guys have been doing some new observations to share, right?
Yeah, so as Steve mentioned, we did the kind of UK election and specifically looking at trustworthiness in the context of Boris Johnson proroguing Parliament. But we also kind of measured the other politicians on all of these messenger traits that we list. And there were some kind of interesting patterns, and it kind of largely supports previous theory showing that liberals are more likely to kind of tend towards warmth and softer traits, and conservatives are kind of powering ahead with more dominant, harder traits. And that was actually, I think, very robust, that finding. But we've done it here in the UK, and we've also been looking in the US at the Democratic Party elections for the nominee, and again, it's just fascinating to see these kind of patterns emerge in ways that are kind of somewhat predictable, but actually paint a much more nuanced picture of what's going on than just the kind of one-line approval rating. Looking at specific traits is just much more informative if you have the right traits to be looking at. And so in particular then we find, Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders listed as, the most prominent candidates. They're very well known. They've got that name recognition, which does carry a lot of weight. They're the heavyweights. They're credible. But actually then Biden's doing far less well on other very important traits, including competence and trustworthiness. Where he does well is warmth. So that's kind of interesting, and fits again with this old man stereotype of your kind of warm but incompetent grandfather type thing. And funnily, Bernie Sanders doesn't have that. He doesn't suffer from that same stereotype. He's seen as competent and charismatic. He's doing pretty well according to our messenger traits. But it's gonna be perhaps a disadvantage that he's the risky choice and coming from a more extreme political position. So that's an example where the messenger and the message really need might have to align.
So if chaotic times tend to produce more dominant styles in the leaders, and it's still a very chaotic time, is it possible that the liberals are missing the boat on this?
Yeah, quite possibly. But
I think there needs to be some, and I recognize the primaries start pretty soon, but I think there will need very, very quickly to be some sort of coherence or coalesce around a central appealing message. There's 7 or 8 candidates still. There's quite a disparity in terms of the centricity or the extreme left of their message. So, I think a combination, Joe's exactly right, of, the right messenger, but also that kind of consensus about what the right message is going to be important. And a good backstory as well, actually, interestingly. Yep. We wrote about this a couple of months ago, that, often, our ability to connect to and be willing to kind of listen and support a messenger is often contingent on the backstory that they actually they tell. And so, I think there's probably some work to be done there and some opportunity as well.
Is that? Oh, I'm sorry to interrupt. Is that backstory about connectedness more than, or is it? Does it matter if it's that hard part or is it that soft part that is there, or again, is that contextual? I'm just trying to imagine that. I would think the backstory would want to be one of relatedness, that connectedness.
Yeah.
I feel like they understand me, I understand them.
Yeah,
but I'm not sure.
I agree. I mean, context. We're a group of behavioral scientists, so context matters an awful lot.
Matters.
It does, but I think you're exactly right about that. So when in the book we talk about the importance of a backstory, and that's actually we account for that in the vulnerability chapter. And actually, we cite evidence that shows that, for example, in things like talent shows, America's Got Talent, X Factor, Dancing with the Stars, these kind of things that often it's not just the skill and the competence of the performer, it's their ability to connect to the audience because they have an interesting backstory, or sometimes kind of like a vulnerability to their backstory. They came through difficult times. They, overcome, significant challenges early in their life. Some commentators have actually gone so far as to actually say that talent actually doesn't count for as much in the likelihood for them winning a competition as a good, compelling, connective backstory. So very much a vulnerability in that context. Yeah.
Do you think it makes a difference whether the backstory is provided in advance of the performance or after?
I would think that you want to frame it in advance so that people come in and the way that they process it takes on a whole new different meaning rather than having to retrospectively process what you've just heard. It kind of primes you ready for something that you're about to hear. But I think it is interesting. I think there's some very, very good work on the different types of backstory and when each will be effective. So the typical one being the kind of underdog backstory of the kind of, two guys working in a basement or a garage or something who then make this multi-million-dollar company. And that evokes a lot of compassion. And it makes them relatable. It's the success story of coming from nowhere as opposed to just, having it handed to you on a plate. And so in some of the studies that have been conducted on this, then they find that people who are a kind of more compassionate mindset or particularly kind of lower power groups like to hear this kind of underdog story. Whereas people who are kind of at the top of, specifically primed to feel pride in the experimental studies, like a kind of top dog. They go more for a hard kind of character. And, I think Donald Trump's an interesting one because you see him kind of trying to pull both of these where he was, saying, I got a small loan and made myself, I'm a kind of self-made millionaire. Of course, the reality was he was always a very rich individual. Yeah. And flaunting his business successes to show how on top he is, how kind of competent and high profile, high positioned.
He's a fascinating example in that instance of where fame and riches crowd out competence and experience. And actually, there's a really interesting guy, Zach Tamala, actually. He's at Stanford. He actually did his PhD under Bob Cialdini. And he's actually done research that actually shows that often audiences, when faced with this dilemma, who should I follow? Who should I support? Who should I listen to? That very often potential can actually be a much more compelling reason to listen than the reality of someone's experience.
You wrote about that in the book.
Yeah, and I think, to a certain extent, that actually explains some of the reason why, to some, Trump was this compelling leader. He didn't have a day of experience in terms of public service, whereas Clinton, you could argue, was probably the most qualified presidential candidate ever that ran for office. And maybe that's something about Trump. Maybe his potential just made him a little bit more interesting. And with that, infamy and rich resources that he actually had that, as Joe said a few months ago, really does speak to that more kind of conservative type of, I've got success on my side, I'm, big and rich and I'm this. Maybe that combination of things just worked out well and served him well in that instance.
Well, I think it's interesting because you talked about the backstory, and he had The Apprentice for how many years, which was almost this television backstory about him that he was able to actually curate and to a certain degree control the message that was going out about who he was and the type of person he was to position that in a way that I think probably, to your point, impacted a certain contingent of the population to view him in a certain way. So,
okay, you teed up this idea of we were talking about America's Got Talent or UK Got Talent and the underdog story. I want to get a little closer to the musical side of our discussion because I can't resist. And I also can't resist because Steve did give me a thumbs up when I mentioned music earlier. So I'm just going to take that as a very positive sign.
There you go.
So let's start with sort of a softball. I kind of want to get into is there any kind of correlation between the hard and soft things and what's on your playlist? But let's just start with what's on your playlist. What Joe, why don't you start? What are you listening to right now?
Well, I'm a sucker for Spotify's Discover Weekly algorithm. Once you give it enough data, it just seems to generate amazing hidden gems. Most of them on my playlist are kind of soul funk kind of songs. So Betty a Swan is one of the hidden gems I've discovered. A kind of soul-y 60s singer who has actually a really depressing life story when I looked into it, but the music is just incredible, and she just doesn't seem to have been recognized for it at all. So there's Betty. It's spelled kind of funny. It's Betty, I think. Maybe it's Betty. I don't know. But okay. One of my recommendations.
Where's she from?
From the US.
Yeah, she's US.
Yeah.
Interesting. That sounds cool. Who else? So are there other? Do you like the classic funk or the classic soul? Do you go back to the 60s?
Yeah, a lot of 60s stuff. I mean, Otis Redding is a good example of one of these classic cases. I'm trying to think who else would it be on my list.
Any of the is it possible that you might like Prince or any of the famous Minnesota musicians that came from around our neck of the woods?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Prince is a classic.
Yeah, Steve, how about you? What's on your playlist?
Well, I'm kind of, as I'm getting older, I'm finding myself kind of summarizing my playlist a lot more. I'm more likely to listen more and more to music that I've listened to over the years than kind of open myself up to new things, which is probably not a good thing. I'm a kid of the 80s, so I love the new romantic stuff. Probably my favorite band of all time would be the Electric Light Orchestra, and the Beatles, of course. And actually, the band that I've seen most recently, who I'd seen a number of times before, who just seem to get better and better the older they get, is New Order. So I'm a massive fan. I'm a massive New Order fan.
I think you're speaking Kurt's language on that one.
All right, there you
go. But I was introduced to something recently, so it's new to me. I'm probably going to mention this. You go, oh my God, they've been going for years and years. But again on Spotify, I came across a band called the Baseballs, who essentially they do covers of really, really big selling pop hits. So think Britney, Taylor Swift, Prince, ABBA, these kind of things. But they do it to a kind of like jazz, bass kind of type of background. It's just the Baseballs. They do these incredible covers of ridiculously popular pop hits, and they're brilliant.
Okay. We will make sure that they're included in the show notes because that sounds like a very interesting recommendation as well. And of course, we love hearing about new music. Okay, so what about this hard versus soft? Is it possible that your playlist might be dominated by the more chaotic types singers, more dominant singers versus songwriters that are going after backstory and connectedness?
I just wonder whether or not the selection of your music it determines in that moment in time whether you are setting out to be a hard messenger or a soft messenger.
That's where I was going, because I'm thinking about my playlist, and I have some very hard, angry music, as we've talked about before, and yet I have some very soft, melodic, various different pieces, and I'm like going, all right, so do I take on a different, persona as each of those goes? And anyway,
yeah, Joe, you have a thought on this?
Well, no, I was just thinking personally, I mean, all my music is very happy, very much in the soft camp. But actually, it's interesting because happy is not necessarily soft. I mean, I think you'd think of an acoustic guitar, kind of Ed Sheeran, some of the, or even Adele, some of these kind of sadder songs, they're still soft. I wouldn't describe them as hard songs.
Yeah.
So maybe happiness, and positivity was not I mean, my playlists are all very positive and uplifting, but maybe that's not a symptom of soft. I'm trying to get into the nitty gritty of what music is hard messenger, what's soft messenger.
Well, Steve, I want to go back to New Order, right? And so if you think, because again, this is actually music I can talk about when most of the time Tim can dominate this conversation. But, Joy Division, prior to that, and they were really, I mean, if you listen to Joy Division's lyrics and even the music, it was, talking death and a whole bunch of down. And New Order, when, they came and rebranded the band, kind of as the outfall after the lead singer.
He committed suicide, didn't he? That was
and they kind of came with a more poppy, fun kind of sound and had a different perspective. And from that perspective, I wonder if that hard versus soft element was a key piece there.
At least for the primary songwriter.
Yeah. So
I think you could be onto something there. That predisposition that Ian had towards the more kind of, much more melodramatic, kind of almost depressive type of kind of music. And then Bernie Summer comes in and, it's a lot more, percussion trained guy who's a lot more upbeat. And then I guess, that you're talking about.
Peter Hook tried to put some deeper into it, but not really. And they're all going at it. So,
and it's kind of like late 70s, 78, 79. So the electronic era started to come in. So, tracks like Thieves Like Us, and then ultimately, Blue Monday, and and the rest. Kind of, they probably didn't have that technical capability in the mid '70s when Joy Division were leading, and so there's probably a combination of those things. What's interesting to me about music and messenger effects, though, is think about how it works in reverse. So how often these quite well-known musicians are listened to on subjects that they have no right to talk about. And I mean, there's actually a recent example of, in China, there was a significant challenge that the health boards in China had to deal with when a pop star, a Cantonese pop star, claimed on WhatsApp that anyone that received the flu vaccine, there was a 90% chance they'd actually get the virus. So there's someone that's like well known, in the public spotlight, rich and famous, but has no medical training and no right to say those kind of things, but it is being believed in that instance. So you've kind of talked about messenger effects applied to music, but actually the musicians and their undue influence sometimes when it's not warranted is going in the other direction. So there's a connection there as well.
We see that all the time with any famous actor, musician, various things that you guys even wrote. I mean, I think about Taylor Swift and, her impact on the midterm elections and various different pieces. So, which is, again, fascinating to me. And going back to, there was an ad in the US. I don't know if it was ever played over in the UK for many years, which was an actor who was, promoting a medical kind of thing. And he said, "I'm not a doctor, but I play one on TV." Right. And so, going back to your traits, right. He doesn't have competence, but yet he just has this acting thing. Yet they're trying, I think, to build some of that competence by saying, I played a doctor on TV to make that connection. And it's really
and I'm reminded also of in that instance in 2002, I think it was, there was quite a well-known survey that was published in the US where they said, who is the most popular president of all time, and the number one popular president had never ever served a day in the White House. It was Martin Sheen who played Jed Bartlett in The West Wing.
Wow.
So there we go. And you could probably think, 2002, 2003, some of the conflicts that were actually going on and who was actually, in the administration at the time, why perhaps, someone as connected and as approachable and a kind of a tenured economics Nobel Prize winning professor, all those kind of messenger traits, combined to make this person, wow, this not the perhaps most noted president of all time, but the person in this instance that we would prefer to have. Yeah. And so in that survey, yeah. So
well, Cialdini, we talked to Bob Cialdini about music, and we talked about playlists, and Bob was quick to point out about how he uses self-priming by or priming in with music by making sure that when he's introduced on stage, he has a stinger, he has a introductory musical piece that is Aretha Franklin's "Think," and he's using "Think" as the song to get people in that completely subconscious, instantaneous state of being of, I'm going to cause you to think. I hope to be introducing something to you that's going to be different. Do you guys use priming? Do you guys music to prime in your presentations or in your?
I don't, but that's a great idea. I'm now thinking, maybe I'll play "Respect" by Franklin.
Maybe Right Said Fred, "I'm Too Sexy, Joe."
One good example recently was Bernie Sanders, after he had his heart attack, came on to AC/DC, "Back in Black."
Oh, yes, there you go.
That was it, wasn't it? He came and it was his "I'm Back." What do they call it? His comeback or something. And he came and spoke to 25,000 people in Queens, and it seemed to work pretty well.
I think that's a good point to just kind of draw to a close of this.
Yes,
a "Back in Black" and "Right Said Fred." There you go. Can't get much better than that. So, Sam and Joe, thank you. This has been really informative, and I know our listeners will get a great deal of information from this. And again, for our listeners, please, Messengers is a great book. Where can they go out to get it? Is it available everywhere? Or yeah,
it's available everywhere. So all the usual online bookstores. It's available as an ebook as well. You can go to the website and find out more. You can even there's even a free quiz that you can do that will let you know what your primary messenger trait is. It takes 5 or 6 minutes, entirely free. You go to messengersthebook.com. You answer 8 or 9 questions that Joe and I and a couple of our research team have put together, and it'll give you a profile of what your preferred messenger trait is.
Great. And if they wanted to follow you or get in touch with you, is it Twitter? How can they find out more about you guys?
Well, in the US, they can contact either me or Bob through the influenceatwork.co.uk or influenceatwork.com website. We're both on Twitter. What are you, Joe Marks 13?
Joe Marks 13. Good memory.
Yeah. All right.
And I'm Science of Yes. But you can find us once you if you Google Steve Martin, once you get past that imposter of mine, you'll find me. I'm
as funny.
I'm a constant source of disappointment to hotel check-in staff.
No, actually, is it kind of fun though? Like, oh, you're Steve Martin. Do you get that a lot?
Yeah, but I don't get the upgraded room afterwards. I invariably get the room next to the elevator.
It's been a pleasure, Steve and Joe. Thank you so much for both of you taking time. This has been so much fun to talk with both of you.
That's great. Thank you.
All the best.
Cheers.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our Behavioral Grooves conversation with Steve and Joe, have a free-flowing discussion, and talk about whatever else comes into our messenger-influenced brains.
Yes, messenger.
Yeah.
Man,
So there's a quote from the book that I love, and it's actually in the introduction, which
which you were able to get through.
I got more than the introduction read through. Come on, I read.
I know.
Yeah, anyway, but it's this, and I think it struck me. I underlined it. I started. I did all that kind of stuff. Frequently, we tend to judge an idea not on its merits, but according to how we judge the person putting it forward.
That's the thesis of the book, right there.
That is the thesis of the book. I think it is well written. It is insightful. There's been lots of research on it. And it really makes me sad.
It is saddening, isn't it?
It is. It is this element of human nature that we put more emphasis on who is telling us something than the merits of the content of the idea.
Right, and this is part of the problem, is that it dilutes the idea of a meritocracy, where someone with better ideas could get ahead.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And so you look at the idea of, again, as we talked in the episode, if you say something and it goes nowhere, and then a week later I come in and say something, and all of a sudden it gathers all this traction. And it's because of not the merits of the idea, but because people like me better than they like you.
Oh, well, everybody knows that. So you're not,
or vice versa.
You're not sharing anything new there.
No, and we joke, but it is this idea that signs of wealth, of power, of the other attributes that they talk about are as important, or sometimes more important, to the content of the message or the idea itself, and that
right.
I know it happens. I understand that it happens. It is one of those things that I just wish didn't.
Yeah.
Because I think the world would be a much better place if we were able to judge ideas based on the content of the ideas and not, the character who is presenting those ideas.
But that's hard. That's really hard, especially with the number of ideas that our brains are being exposed to these days.
Yeah.
It was one thing to have a brain that's set up to be thoughtful about ideas 500 years ago, when I just don't think that there was as much new ideas coming at medieval life, than there is today. There's just so much. I sometimes read, I look at Twitter sometimes, and I see people who have 20, 60, 80, 100, 200,000, millions of followers, and they'll have some trite little commentary like, it's all about the goal and not about it's all about the journey, not about the end. It's like, and that's their tweet, and hundreds of people liked it, and it's been retweeted dozens of times, and you go, that's okay, that's it's a good thought. But really, like, if I put that out there, zero. It would have been like crickets. The internet wouldn't have given one flying flip that I put it out there. But someone with a lot of followers, all of a sudden, now, and this just reinforces to me that it isn't about the quality of the message. It's about the messenger.
It is about the messenger.
It's who versus what, right?
Yeah, and Steve and Joe talk. I think they bring in a really insightful insight about what it is, what are some of the qualities and the characteristics of the messenger that lend that to be a more influential message, right?
Yeah.
And it goes back to, Steve's work with Cialdini and persuasion, and which was looking, as he eloquently said at the beginning, look, we looked at the content and what makes the content persuasive, right?
Yeah.
And you looked at some of the human interactions of how you're working within their reciprocity and other aspects of that. But you didn't look at necessarily just the messenger in and of itself.
Right.
And so I think that was a really, I think it's powerful. Chris Graves from Ogilvy, in one of the conversations that we saw back a couple years ago that he was talking about, he brought up the same concept.
Same thing, yes, he did.
The messenger effect, and the idea that in today's hyper political world, that the messenger has much more sway over our perception of an idea than the actual content of it.
Which kind of gets to the hard and soft traits.
Yes.
Right. And I love the way that these guys have broken down these and made explicit these specific traits, because it helps by putting a name on these things. I think it helps me think about, what are people using and what are people responding to?
Yeah.
One of the greatest examples was in this time of chaos, we really we tend to defer to the harder traits. Right. The harder messenger traits tend to get more traction.
So again, just to those traits again, established status, socio-economic position, right? Competence, dominance, and attractiveness are those hard traits.
Yeah.
Which, all but attractiveness, I would be all right on, I think.
I think you could even get attractiveness going.
Oh, God. No. But, and then on the soft messenger traits, right, there's warmth, there's vulnerability, there's trustworthiness, there's charisma. So you look at those and you go, all right, which of those traits do people elicit? And then how does that drive the way that people interpret their messages? So again, going on that component and going into the tribal nature that we have and the politicized nature that we have, another interesting piece that they brought up is some of the, all right, so are the hard traits more aligned with some of the conservative notions of what that is, and versus the soft traits are more aligned with liberals? And does that just feed into the whole, snowflake versus,
real
gun-bearing patriot?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I guess it might, right? That's certainly possible. And it didn't sound like Joe and Steve have got everything wrapped up they don't have a bow tied around that part of the story. But it did remind me of Jonathan Haidt's work on the moral foundations.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and there's a definite difference in, how people come at the world, which influences or is being influenced by some of the teams that they have so-called joined.
Right.
So whether those be political or whether they be, cultural, whether they be religious.
Tribal stuff, basically.
Yeah. So.
Yes. I also wanted to talk a little bit about truthfulness versus trustworthiness.
Why? Because you think I'm not truthful?
Nor are you trustworthy, really.
So I have none of the qualities there.
And Kurt, I've been meaning to have this conversation for a long time. So are you sitting down?
I'm sitting across from you. Of course I'm sitting down. No, it's all right. Let's go.
Well,
Truthfulness versus trustworthiness.
What really, really struck me was that comment about Boris Johnson, that 75% of the people said, yeah, I think that he lied. A pretty high degree of agreement that people said, yeah, he did lie, but is he trustworthy? The people who were in support of Boris Johnson's position, which was to leave, which was a Brexit, basically had no effect on their perception.
Yeah.
Was he still trustworthy? Hell yes.
He's lying to achieve the goal that I agree with. So that is a trustworthy person.
Right, because they're willing to lie for something that I believe in that will defend my tribe, right?
Yeah. Man. It goes back again, we've ad nauseum talked about, Trump's statement about saying could shoot somebody in the middle of Times Square and his followers would still be all for him.
That's right. He'd never be convicted.
Which is a scary thought, and which is the ultimate conclusion of what this book is saying, is basically if we get to the point where the messenger becomes such a figure that they can do no wrong, then we have a really tainted, I think, society.
Yeah.
Which goes into, what we really didn't discuss are there ways to combat this? Are there ways? Can we do it as an individual? So I don't fall prey, because I know I fall prey to this. I know I do.
Yes.
But it's hard to know when and how.
And your followers fall prey to you.
all zero of them. Yeah.
No, but right. I mean, this is a big question in my mind as to how we can easily combat, how we can say, wait a minute, I'm paying more attention to the messenger and not the message.
And
I'm not being rational. I'm using much more motivated thinking to get me to defend my tribal position than to actually think critically about an issue.
Well, and I would like to, and we can't do this all the time, but occasionally I do try to do this when I read something and I know who has written it.
Yes.
how would I feel about it if it was written by somebody in a different party, whether it be, the Democrats or the Republicans in America here, or, conservatives and Tory? No, what I can't. In England.
Well, the Tories.
See, I don't understand those two, so I would be better going over there.
Yeah,
right?
Tories are Labor. But this kind of reminds me of something that you talk about often is the high school valedictorian speech.
Yeah, we talked about that, I think, in the episode.
Yeah,
where they bring up the idea that, hey, they're cheering for it, but then they say, oh, wait, that wasn't by X, it was actually by Y, and now people are booing about it. And that in that case, it was a valedictorian in a southern state talking about making a statement, quoting what he said was Trump, and in reality, it was quote from Obama. And there was that visceral reaction in the crowd, and that happens more than we like to believe. But if you find yourself in a situation where somebody presents something to you and you're cheering for it, and all of a sudden they go, oh, wait, that wasn't said by X, it was said by Y, and all of a sudden you find yourself booing, you need to take a hard look at your opinion.
That's right.
Because
it is more noble to really be attached to the merit of the content than it is to the messenger themselves.
And I think there are, opportunities for us as individuals, opportunities for us as a society to do that and to say, if the shoe was on the other foot, how would I feel about it?
Yeah.
You look at going on right now in the impeachment hearings,
yep.
and you see both sides entrenched in their worldview. And if you could just literally, it's amazing to me, and it's on both sides, where you see video clips of some of the politicians from the Clinton impeachment who were in politics at that point. And what they were saying then is 180 degrees opposite of what they are saying now. And it goes on both sides. But there is
because they're defending their tribe.
They're defending their tribe. They're defending the messenger.
Yeah.
And that, again, going back to the meritocracy, right? Ideas, concepts, truth, trustworthiness should be valued based on their intrinsic, components. So,
and it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that.
Yeah. And, so I'm in Rotary. I think I've talked about that before, but Rotary has this 4-way test. And the first one of the 4-way test is it the truth? And whatever you think about Rotary, I think it's a great, social service organization that's out there. But they ask you, you take the 4-way test, and all the things I do, think, and say, is it the truth? Is it beneficial to all concerned? Will it build goodwill and better friendships? I can't remember the fourth. I always forget the fourth one. And who knows? I'm going to get kicked out of Rotary now.
You're done. You're done.
But I like that idea, because if you actually can sit there and if you think, do, and say, right, is it the truth? And so if you take an idea and you just run it through that lens, it might help us. So
I hope we do.
I hope we do too.
Yeah. Okay.
This is kind of a downer of a grooving session.
But, there's all kinds of...
We didn't do a weekly.
Oh, my God. Thank God we didn't do that. Boy, I'm glad no one mentioned weekly. This time. No, I'm glad. But we want to thank our listeners for hanging in there and sharing the story, because one of the greatest things that happens with Behavioral Grooves as a podcast is when someone likes it enough to say to a friend, hey, you got to check this out.
Yeah.
And to maybe share a specific episode, so it's not just big and, read this book, but it's read a chapter, try this specifically. And this would be a great episode to share with somebody, because our discussion with Steve and Joe was just terrific.
So you're saying that this episode could be the gateway drug into the behavioral grooves?
It could be.
Yeah. There you go. What's your gateway drug episode?
And then we're going to get you hooked. And then
You're going to be smoking that pipe every week. There you go.
All right.
Oh, well, thank you, listeners. And remember to stay tuned for the bonus track that Tim is going to do in just a minute. Just a minute. He's going to do it. Really.
I am. I really am.
All right.
I promise. Bonus track coming right up. Hey there. This is Tim with the bonus track for our discussion with Steve Martin and Joe Marks, the authors of Messengers, Who We Listen To, Who We Don't, and Why. The big takeaways from what we discussed come from Steve and Joe's new book and hew along the lines of the hard and soft traits that messengers use to effectively communicate their messages. Joe and Steve researched these traits and broke them down for the book after observing what a person might say that makes no sense yet gets total credit from his or her audience. They noticed that a person could tell very obvious lies and would never lose their trustworthiness if those lies were a means to a desirable end. This is a great example of how the human experience is illogical or irrational or both. The hard messenger traits are often aligned with more conservative thinking, and they include status, socio-economic position, competence, dominance, and attractiveness. The soft messenger traits are more along the lines of warmth, vulnerability, trustworthiness, and charisma, and they tend to be more aligned with liberal thinking. And that leads me to the groove idea for the week. Kurt and I would like to ask you to give some consideration to how you process messages. Think about how you are impacted by the messenger. Take a single conversation or a message that you received this week and look at it closely. It could be a one-on-one conversation with your boss, a client, a neighbor, or a family member. How did the messenger impact the way you received the message? Or as an alternative, think about how you responded to something that you heard in the news or on a podcast. Analyze your response. Were you influenced by who was talking or by the source? Did some of the hard or soft traits of that person or source used impact how you felt and compared it to the content of the message itself? And as a not-so-subtle reminder, please take a few seconds to give us a quick review. Our numbers are growing because of you. Downloads last month were our best yet, and we're on track for this month to be our very best month yet again. And we are still very much focused on what you think and how you feel about our podcast. Please share a note with the world on just how you feel, or if you're more shy, just drop us a line. Thanks, and keep on grooving.